Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later during the question and answer session, please press star 1 to ask a question over the phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I will turn the meeting over to Ms. Alice Yao. Thank you. You may begin.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar for OCR's Racial Harassment and Lao Networks. Our webinar is entitled Issues in the Asian American and Pacific Islander Community. I'm Alice Yao and I'm an attorney in the Program Legal Group at OCR. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and we're joined by Phil Olaya, a policy advisor for WIAPI, and by Priyanka Varma, a student intern with WIAPI. We're really excited for today's webinar and for this new format that we're trying out, the combination of WebEx and the conference line. If you guys have any issues with seeing us, or if there's anything that's acting funny, then please, say something in the chat window and we'll try to address it as quickly as we can. Also, I wanted to mention a few other housekeeping items before we jump in. As Jenny mentioned, all audience members dialed into the conference call line are muted for the presentation portion of today's webinar, and at the end we'll open up the lines for a question and answer session. We really hope that today will generate a lot of discussion about issues in the AAPI community, and we want to hear from you and hear your thoughts and ideas. So we hope that you won't be shy, and throughout the webinar, including during the presentation section, you should feel free to enter any questions or comments into the chat window. If there's any, it's on the right side of your screen. And if there's anything that you want to be anonymous, then you should direct them to the White House Initiative on AAPIs, and they will keep the questioner's identity secret. And please keep in mind that today's webinar is being recorded, but it's only going to be used for internal purposes. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Phil.
Hi, thanks Alice. Welcome everybody. We're very excited you could join us today for this training webinar essentially. I know a lot of you work with these communities, including limited English communities, and hopefully the information you receive here today can help you better, do a better job, and to be able to connect with community resources that might help you as well do your job. So we're especially excited because we're joined by several speakers who have taken time out today to help us out with this webinar. One of our first speakers is Amardeep Singh. He is a commissioner on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and co-founder and director of programs for the Sikh Coalition in New York City. We're also joined by Kin Mai Ong, who is the director of the Educational Equity Project at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, also in New York. With us from the Department of Education is Bob Kim, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategic Operations and Outreach in the Office for Civil Rights. Finally, also with the Department of Education, we are joined by Lillian Dorka, Senior Counsel in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Office for Civil Rights. Just a little background before we begin. The purpose for this webinar, as I mentioned, is sort of a training webinar to talk to you about our community and so the challenges that we face, our students face. It's also to introduce OCR staff to the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and the work we do with the community and with our federal agency partners to help provide resources to connect them to those federal government resources. Part of this webinar will provide a background and do a little educating on the changing demographics of the AAPI community, including some statistics from the most recent census that may surprise some of you. We will briefly update OCR staff on some of the work your office has been doing on AAPI issues. And then at the end, we'll have a discussion with Amr, with Kin, and with Bob, and Lillian as well, on some of these challenges specific to our community and how OCR and WIAPI can work together to address them. So I'd like to introduce Amr to talk a little bit about WIAPI and the SICK Coalition. Amr?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being on this training, as Phil had put it, for our federal partners on our community and some of the issues with school bullying. Let me just give you a quick background on WIAPI, or it's a very long acronym. It's the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. In short, this was something that was started originally by President Clinton near the end of his second term, had a life during the Bush years as a kind of a business initiative, and was re-initiated by President Obama in 2009 with great enthusiasm. And the real purpose of what we're doing at the initiative and the commission that's attached to it, that I'm part of, is really working to connect, in particular, underserved members of the AAPI community to our federal government and to the resources that we know they aren't leveraging. So whether the issue is health care, Social Security, language access, education, immigration, civil rights, it's our job to make sure that the community has a place at the table where important decisions are being made about their lives, by our federal government. Since 2009, just to give you a sense of the scope of our work, we've held more than 200 roundtables in over 25 states and the District of Columbia and the Pacific Islands, reaching over, by our estimate, about 30,000 people. We also have a 30-member interagency working group. I would note that this executive order that created this initiative is unique in that it calls upon every federal agency to create a plan to better connect the AAPI community to the federal government. So to that end, the initiative has also published a guide to leveraging federal agency resources for AAPI community, and we've created also a federal government-wide language translation clearinghouse as a result of the oil spill in the Gulf that's helped us do better with some of our language access issues. Finally, I would just say that on the issue of education, the initiative is really proud of its work to collect successful data disaggregation policies for AAPI student data, which in part is relevant for today's discussion. And then we've also worked with something called the Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institutions, or ANAPISIs, to certify them as ANAPISI organizations so that they can access federal funding. And that's risen from 87% to 126%, as a result of the work of the initiative. I think that's it. That's it for what I'll say about the initiative. At the end of the day, it really is our job on behalf of the White House, with the mandate of the President, to connect our federal agencies to our AAPI community better. Let me go to the next slide really quickly and just talk about my day job. My commissioner turban that I wear, so to speak, is something that is on a volunteer effort, me and 19 other commissioners around the country. My day job, though, is with the SICK Coalition. It's, as the bullet point says, the largest SICK civil rights organization in the country. We have 4 program areas: a legal program, an advocacy program, education, and then an organizing program. We have worked in particular on the issue of school bullying, since it affects our community so acutely. And I'd say that with ALDEF, and you're going to hear from Kin Mayong from ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, in a little bit, but we helped persuade the city of New York to enact a regulation that creates a response structure on the issue of school bullying for the over 1.4 million public school students in this great city. And then finally, just something to put in the back of your head, we're releasing a survey report with ALDEF this fall. And one of the main findings, you're getting a preview, don't tell anybody, but it's over half of the kids AAPI kids that we surveyed reported bias-based harassment in city schools. So this is all to say that we found that this issue of school bullying as it applies to the AAPI community is quite acute and needs the attention and energy of our federal agencies. With that, I'll hand it over to Ken from ALDEF.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me? So I'm the Director of the Educational Equity Program at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. A little bit of background about ALDEF in general. We were founded in 1974, and in addition to my program, the Educational Equity Program, we also have an immigrant rights program as well as voting rights and community development and a variety of other issues that impact our community. We are a little different from other legal defense funds in that in addition to doing litigation, we also do advocacy, community education, and direct organizing in conjunction with legal and community groups across the country. In my project specifically, a lot of the work that we do really conforms very closely to the work that WIAPI and OCR have been, as well as the Department of Justice's educational equity program, look at as far as English language learner rights, anti-Asian bias, anti-immigrant bias, and general civil rights discrimination. We also work on a variety of other issues in the community relating to like school integration and gang profiling, but we find that our partnership with the federal agencies represented today are very important in securing our rights and making sure that there is a federal component to the work that we're doing and connecting the work that we're doing on the ground in different communities with legislative policy and sometimes federal civil rights investigatory work that's being done on your end. In addition, we have the National Asian American Education Advocates Network, which is a network of youth groups, parent groups, and education advocates across the country located in places like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Providence, Rhode Island, Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Seattle, and the San Francisco Bay Area, which meets periodically in person in New York, and we also stay in touch to talk about different issues that we're seeing on the ground relating to these various topics in education that we focus on so that we can share notes as well as grab their experience and have that inform our work that we do in Washington, D.C. with our partners in the federal government, particularly relating to English language learner rights, anti-Asian harassment, and general discrimination. So with that, I will go on and talk a little bit about the demographics in our community to set up this discussion. AAPI, I guess we're talking specifically about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who, as you know, traditionally have been lumped together demographically. Now there's an effort to look at those numbers separately, but we still include that together in the interest of broader coalition building and showing how this community that's been tracked together has changed over time. But essentially, currently there's about 18 million Asian American and Pacific Islander people in this country. They represent over 30 different countries and 50 different ethnic groups. So we'll talk a little bit later about what this means in terms of the broad diversity within our community. There's also over 100 different languages, and about 2/3 of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are foreign-born currently, and they constitute about 1/3 of the million or so legal immigrants that enter the United States each year. It's the AAPI community is also a very fast-growing community, as this graph shows. Between 2000 and 2010, which of course were the last two census years, the Asian American and Pacific Islander community grew by 42.97%, so almost 43%. And they were the fastest growing racial group in the country. And based on growth projections, in the next 40 years, Asian American Pacific Islander community is expected to grow 134% from our current base to 35.6 million. So what we're seeing now is that while we're, I think, like 4 or so % of the overall population, we're on the upswing, and particularly in certain urban and suburban areas where our communities are concentrated in enclaves, we're having more and more of a visible presence with particular needs that are being presented and need to be addressed. So I think it's fantastic that this webinar is happening and that you guys are looking at this issue to see how we can serve this growing community better. And with that, I will turn it, I think, back to Amr for the next phase.
Thanks so much, Ken. This next slide is pretty self-explanatory. I think what it does is, and Phil said you might be surprised by some of the data here, but we've seen the most explosive AAPI growth in states where there haven't been huge AAPI populations before, places like Nevada, Arizona, North Dakota. In the last, from 2000 to 2010, the population in those 3 states almost doubled. You can see where the most growth is in the rest of the list on slide 9. But this is all to say that the community, as Ken just mentioned, is growing, and it's growing as fast as, if not faster than, most racial groups in their respective states. Let's go to the next slide. And here you're going to get a sense of also the growth of the NHPI community, the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community, in some of the key states. And again, my guess is most folks wouldn't have guessed that Arkansas, has seen a 251% increase in the number of NHPIs in their state, or that Alaska or Alabama have seen more than double the increase in the number of NHPIs, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, in those states. This all is to buttress the larger point that the community, the API community, is growing in leaps and bounds. And so as federal agencies, we should expect to hear from these communities much more than we might have in the past, because they're just growing and becoming more and more organized, as I'm sure all of our WIAPI White House Initiative staff can attest. The next slide that I'm going to just go over really quickly is just an FYI slide. You might want to just note down some of these links to get better data on both Asian Americans and NHPIs here in the United States. If there's a particular part of the country you're interested in, or if you're interested in some demographic data, some socioeconomic data on these communities beyond just their population growth. As I'm sure all our partners know, the census is amazing at putting forth that data that gives you a better sense of who you're working with when you're trying to implement federal programs that are responsive to the dynamics on the ground. So I'm just continuing to talk on this slide because I'm hoping that some of you might note down these links and consider using them as you put forth plans to better address the needs of the AAPI community. With that, I will hand it over to Bob to talk about some of the English language learner statistics.
Thanks, Amr, and thanks to you and Ken and Phil for being on the call with us today, and thanks to my colleagues Alice and Lily, who are here with me. Just a few comments about the ELL statistics nationwide. It's, as I think is clear to all of you on the call, there is a significant AAPI population that is LEP, or limited English proficient. Nearly 1 in 6 AAPI students is LEP, and nearly 4% live in a household where all adult members of the household has has or had difficulty with English. And just as a background, nearly a third of all Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the country are LEP, or limited English proficient. Some of the disaggregated categories within that are eye-opening and a good reminder of our population. Southeast Asian Americans with less than a high school diploma, that percentage is pretty staggering. 23% of Hmong, 26% of Laotian, and 28% of Cambodian populations do not complete high school in the United States. So those are among the highest non-completion rates, I think, even compared with other minority populations in the U.S. And I think for us, it's a good reminder as we do our work in OCR, as many of you from the OCR team know this, we are not only working on harassment and discrimination cases here, but we're also trying to ensure equitable access to resources and equitable access to the pathways that in high school that would lead students toward graduation. And so statistics like these are a reminder that we have work to do to ensure that there's equitable treatment of these API populations in our work. Another statistic is that only 15% of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders 25 years of age or older have at least a bachelor's degree, in comparison with 28% for the total population and 50% of the greater Asian American population. So there's clearly work to do on the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander side of our community. And again, this is a reminder for the department. We have new initiatives even outside of OCR dealing with increasing college completion across minority groups. And so the conversation about Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders should be among the top of the list when we're trying to deal with college completion nationwide. And then finally, just as a reminder, the AAPI community has the second highest percentage of ELL students among all racial groups. And now I think I will turn it and just one more statistic here is that the top 5 ELL languages in the AAPI community are Chinese, Vietnamese, Hindi, Korean, and Hmong. And now I think I'll turn it back over to Amar.
Great, thanks so much, Bob. And I'll just say that at a high level, the point of the next few set of slides is really just to illustrate, after I get past the English learner piece, how acute bullying is in the community. But first, on the issue of English language learners, building off what Bob said, I just want to say that, and let me move to that next slide. I apologize. In terms of what the White House initiative has done on this particular issue, I pretty much want to highlight the middle bullet point and note that we've asked, by authority of the executive order signed by the President, that all 23 federal agencies submit annual plans on how those agencies will provide linguistically and culturally competent access to federal programs and services in the API community. And I would say that, from a staff perspective, the initiative has devoted a great amount of time to this issue because of, as Bob said, the number of English language learners and LEP individuals we have in our community. And I would just say that I would remind our federal agencies, on the line, of how important this particular issue is to this administration. I'd also add that we do have an interagency working group that has as I mentioned before, and it has a language access subcommittee that focuses its time across agencies on how we can discuss challenges, but also best practices when it comes to language access. This is all to say on this slide that for the White House initiative and for the President, the issue of addressing the needs of English language learners is top priority for us. And to the extent that you need help thinking through those issues, please call upon the initiative. As I said, we do have a subcommittee, a language access subcommittee across federal agencies that thinks about this issue in particular. Next, so what I was previewing before, let me just share some of what's come up as some of the stats when it comes to bullying in the API community. And I think they're going to be, these are numbers that folks are just not aware of. And the first that I'd highlight is, right there in that, right up there, which is students in the Asian American community reported the highest rate of classroom school bullying, 20% higher than any other race or ethnic group. I'll say that again. Asian American students reported the highest rate of classroom bullying out of any racial or ethnic group. Over half of the kids in our community, according to the federal stats, reported being bullied at school, and that it occurred in the classroom. And as you can, interestingly enough, this tracks really well with All Deafs and the Sick Coalition's data, which we're publishing this fall. On the issue of sick school children, the organization I have my day job at, the Sick Coalition, has found that more than 65% of sick students in New York City and in the Bay Area report being bullied at school. And then finally, in terms of the issue of being bullied outside of school grounds, luckily the federal data goes into that level of detail. Asian Americans reported being bullied at a rate 20% higher than whites and 10% higher than the next racial group. So there's some consistency here. Whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom, Asian Americans are reporting being bullied more than any other racial group. It should all give us a bit of pause and hopefully get us thinking about what we can do to address this dynamic, for which we now have good data about the problem. Let me also go into the issue of cyberbullying on this next slide. And as you can see here, again, Asian Americans are being reported being cyberbullied at a rate, higher than any other racial group. In this case, 40% higher than any other racial group. And let me just say this about cyberbullying. As a kid, I didn't obviously have to deal with cyberbullying because I'm dating myself. I'm on the older end, and so there was no Facebook and Twitter and text messaging, no cell phones in school and the like. And so what we're finding is, in terms of bullying, whether it's again, in the classroom, outside of the classroom, or even when you get home on the computer, Asian Americans are reporting consistently the highest rates of school bullying out of any other racial group. On the issue of sexual orientation, let's note that AAPI students are less likely to reveal their sexual identity to their parents. And I'm sure that feeds into the dynamic of bullying being more acute in terms of its psychological impact on AAPI students in our community who are LGBTQ. And finally, 15% of kids in our community, Asian American kids, high school students, have reported seriously considering suicide, sadly, and that rate is higher than that for African American and non-Hispanic white students. This is all to say, these last two slides, that bullying anywhere and everywhere for kids in our community is as acute, or I should say more acute, than it is for any other racial group that the federal government is looking at. It's a top priority civil rights issue for this particular community. In terms of what this initiative has done to help address this issue, we've had outreach meetings with 28 AAPI groups, as the first bullet said. We've had webinars on how to file a claim with both OCR who's convening today's call, and the Department of Justice. We've participated at the Federal Partners in Bullying Prevention Conference. It's an annual conference now that's done on the issue of school bullying. We hosted an AAPI Bullying Prevention Summit in New York. The commission that I'm part of played a large role in helping organize that. Kin here at ALDEF on the community side played a huge role in helping organize that particular summit, where we brought on the issue of cyberbullying. We had like Facebook, MTV come to that summit and talk about cyberbullying. We had the Department of Justice come to the Bullying Prevention Summit and talk about its SPIRIT program for schools that are trying to work through the issue with their students on preventing bullying. We also had OCR and Department of Education, OCR and Department of Justice come to talk about how to file a complaint of bullying. And then we've begun to disseminate translated materials to the API community. But let me say this on our efforts at WIOPI, they're not enough. There's a lot more that we can do, and if folks, when we get a chance for discussion, have ideas, please share them. These listening, even me repeating these stats again, is reminding me once again how acute this issue is in the community, and that we have to and must do more, including the White House initiative, to address it. So with that, I'll ask Kin to talk about some of the work she did through ALDEF and the federal government did in a particularly acute situation in Philadelphia.
Great, thank you, Amar. So some of you, a couple of years, or I guess now about 4 years ago, read about a very serious incident of harassment against a group of Asian students at South Philadelphia High School in December 2009. It was a matter that ALDEF worked on and ultimately leveraged support, investigation, and legal leverage from the Department of Justice, the federal government, as well as the Philadelphia State Human Rights Commission, and were able to get a very satisfactory settlement, consent decree, and federal monitoring. To give you a little bit of background, South Philadelphia High School is a large, basically majority-minority inner-city high school in South Philadelphia, which has had over the past decade or more an increase in the Asian American immigrant population, and particularly low-income, limited English proficient students from China, from Vietnam, as well as neo-refugees from places like Myanmar. And we at ALDEF had connected up with some of the student groups at South Philadelphia High School through the help of some local community groups that do some amazing work on the ground there. Asian Americans United particularly took the lead, but there were a number of other groups that got involved. And we actually documented an escalating cycle of violence there going as far back as 2008, like a full year before this happened. And it probably happened even before, but that was when our work kind of started to gather steam, and we documented an increasing escalating pattern of more or less isolated incidents of violence and harassment, in the sense that it was usually one or two victims, and there was no response at all, and certainly for more minor incidents of a racial or anti-immigrant nature, there was no response at all, no prevention work, no effort to address these things. So in December of 2009, I believe it was December 3rd, there was a series of ongoing violent incidents throughout the day within the school, where students were beaten up in classrooms, in halls, in the cafeteria. The school officials had really just were completely inept. They didn't know how to herd the students from kind of one place to the other to avoid problems from happening, and the violence kind of came to a head. At the end of the day, when the Asian students, there was an effort to kind of escort the Asian students home, whereas it probably would have been safer, I think, to not kind of do this in an en masse way, but in any event, that they were on their way home when there was a major clash from some of with some of the other students, and about 30 students were injured and 13 students were sent to the emergency room with pretty serious injuries. So after that, ALDA worked with local community groups that we've been working with to document what happened, to document how the school and the school district of Philadelphia failed to respond to our complaints over the past year, and really to make clear that we were not blaming the students kind of who were the attackers, even though we felt that they needed to be at this point punished, but they needed to be addressed, but that it was really the root of the problem was more the school and the school district failure to set some standards of behavior, to address more minor incidents and engage in prevention so that students know that certain standards of behavior are in place and that they can't get away with attacking anybody or using bias-based language. We also wanted to make sure that the school officials knew what to do if there was an incident, whether it was more minor or more serious, to respond appropriately with corrective action if there was a minor incident, or ranging from investigation and potential criminal investigation or even discipline in a more serious event, as well as to provide victim services. So we filed a complaint before the Department of Justice, and we also did a companion complaint before the Philadelphia Human Rights Commission. It was actually modeled on an earlier matter where we worked closely with the Department of Justice in New York City in 2004. There was an earlier matter where ALDA didn't actually file the complaint, but where we worked with some local community groups to document a very similar pattern of violence against Asian immigrant students in Lafayette High School in Bensonhurst, which also culminated in a federal civil rights consent decree and monitoring. And that's also what, fortunately, we were able to obtain here in Philly. So after, I think, a good part of a year investigating, the Department of Justice and the Philadelphia Human Rights Commission came out with a settlement and consent decree which required better definition of prohibited behavior, of bullying, of harassment, better investigation procedures, better infrastructure to provide for interpretation and translation to victims, and a clearer protocol for how to deal with these more serious incidents, as well as preventative measures to avoid escalation of more minor incidents. And there was a several-year window for federal monitoring, which actually just closed with the school year that just ended, but we at ALDA continue to work with local community groups to monitor the progress that's been made, as well as to make sure that things don't happen in other schools in the Philadelphia area. I also knew that OCR has been working with the Department of Justice's Community Relations Commission, or Community Relations Service, to do outreach on the issue of bias-based harassment and other secondary schools in Philadelphia in conjunction with other community groups that work there. And I think this type of outreach work is really crucial. We'll talk about it more generally later when we talk about ways for federal agencies to collaborate with community groups, but it's really very helpful in terms of getting the word out to school officials in terms of what their duties are to protect students, as well as to the extent that there's a student training component to let students know what their rights are, and to prevent incidents from escalating to the point that they did in Lafayette and at South Philly. Another segment of our AAPI community that has experienced a particular type of harassment and bias-based crimes has been the Muslim, Sikh, Arab, and South Asian American community. These are issues that also the Sikh Coalition both work on both in New York and nationally. When I first joined ALDA about 10 years ago, a large percentage of my cases, as far as my direct service docket, consisted of discipline against South Asian and Muslim students, including some crazy stuff. Like there was this one student who told, he was an honor student, born in the United States, told his teacher that he was afraid of a terrorist attack, and they suspended him for 5 days and referred him to the police. And fortunately, in that case, the police had good sense not to follow up, but it took quite a bit of effort on our part to get that disciplinary record removed from the student's files. We've also had cases of Muslim students having their hijabs pulled off. We've had students being mistaken for Muslim and being called names based on their ethnic appearance. And it's an ongoing issue that I think, even though it's been more than 10 years since 9/11, is still very serious, and particularly because there are a lot of new immigrants and limited English proficient individuals in those communities. There is a particularly high need to do outreach to make sure that parents of students who are of South Asian and or Arab background or Muslim and Sikh faiths there's really to be a lot of effort to make sure that those parents know their rights and know that they are protected and know that it's okay to stand up for their rights and prevent further problems. And I'll let Amar also talk more about this when he's up next, and he's also really taken the fore on this issue with his work through the Sikh Coalition. And so with that, I will give it back to, I think it's Bob is up next.
Actually, it's me. It's Alice. And we've gotten some feedback that people can't see us. Hopefully you can see us now. If you can't, then please say something in the chat box, and we will do our best to fix the issue. We tried to move the camera a little closer to us so we weren't just blobs far off in the background.
Can you, wait, so Ken, can you see us?
I can see you. I can see you.
Okay, cool.
Okay,
so
great.
Somebody can see us. Okay. Thanks.
I can see you.
Okay, terrific. So the next portion of the presentation, we're going to try to breeze through a little bit so that we can save at least a little bit of time for the discussion that we were hoping to have. So I'm going to talk a little bit about OCR's work on AAPI issues. So a previous slide mentioned that OCR has worked with WIAPI to reach out to AAPI students, parents, teachers, administrators, and community groups to inform them about civil rights protections and legal responsibilities. Some of our more recent policy guidance that's more relevant to the AAPI community includes the October 2010 Dear Colleague letter on bullying and harassment, and also our May 2011 Dear Colleague letter on Plyler. The Civil Rights Data Collection has been doing some work that's relevant to the AAPI community. So the CRDC sample was expanded from 6,000 to 7,000 school districts and added new data items including allegations of harassment, policies regarding harassment, and discipline imposed for harassment. In the past, school districts have been required to report all students of the AAPI community using a single category, Asian/Pacific Islander, and in 2009 to 2010, for that school year, school districts had the option to report such data using an expanded list of racial and ethnic categories, so that would break out Asian as distinct from Native Hawaiian/other Pacific Islander. And during that school year, 2009 to 2010, over 1,500 school districts reported under that expanded list. And beginning with the next school year, 2010 to 2011, all school districts are required to use the expanded list. So currently on the CRDC website, we have the 2009 to 2010 survey data, and the 2011 to 2012 survey data will be available at the end of the year. And Bob is going to describe some of the things that we found from our study of the CRDC.
Thanks, Alice. And so let me just reiterate that the 2011-12 CRDC, which will be available in early 2014 most likely on the web, will report data using 7 race and ethnicity categories. And it doesn't disaggregate all Asian APIs from each other, but it does separate at least the category of Asian and on the one hand, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander on the other hand. It's not perfect. There would still be more work to do to disaggregate further, but I think it's at least a significant step to disaggregate Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander from Asian, because that gives you a little bit better of a snapshot at what's going on in certain civil rights categories than was the case before. So it's, one small step forward, I think, is a sign of progress. Okay, I'm being told to move closer. You can't see my little tiny head. So let me just talk briefly about a few of the data snapshots that we found when you dig down into the civil rights data collection at the district level. We find certain things going on. For example, with respect to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students, in Fayetteville, Georgia, it became clear that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students represented almost 23% of the district's enrollment in that district, but only 5.3% of the students enrolled in calculus and 14.6% of the students enrolled in chemistry. So large disparities there in terms of access to STEM courses needed to graduate high school and enter competitive colleges or any four-year institution, or even for that matter, just any post-secondary. And then in discipline, there's a category still in Fayetteville, Georgia, that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students represented about a third of the students receiving in-school suspensions, but 46.5% of students receiving out-of-school suspensions. So large percentages of discipline rates for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students in that district. In another vignette here in Hayward Unified School District in California, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students represented almost 12% of the district's enrollment, and they represented 20.5% of the students enrolled in chemistry and 29.6% of the students enrolled in calculus. So actually, in that scenario, the students are doing pretty well relative to their population in terms of enrollment in chemistry and calculus. So, we see both negative trends in terms of disparities in access to college and career-ready courses and discipline, but also we see some positive trends as well. So I think that gives you just a little snapshot of kind of the potential of the CRDC to uncover civil rights disparities. And we really do hope that the 11-12 collection, which again is collected from every public school in the country, so that's really important, including charter schools, and so that's 100,000 schools. And I think we're en route to getting near 100% compliance with this data collection, so it's really astounding, and I think we really hope that it serves the community well when looking for potential civil rights issues in school by school, not just district by district, but school by school in the future. And so I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lily on the LEP initiative, and I might even switch seats with you so that people can see it. Are you sure?
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to slide over a little bit?
I can hear it.
Can you see Lily?
Yeah, they should be over here.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lily. And I've obviously had the pleasure of working with many of my LCR colleagues who are on the call today, and the new pleasure of meeting some of our other colleagues from the initiative. I know that our OCR colleagues have a lot of background on this issue in terms of what we've done pursuant to Executive Order 13166, so I don't want to go over that. You have it on the slide. You have some of that background. But given the limited amount of time, I wanted to especially reach out to our other colleagues on the call just to give you a little information about not just OCR, but the Department of Ed, who is really a leader in this area in terms of the federal government and providing access to our LEP customers. And, you know, for years OCR has been enforcing Title VI and looking out for limited English proficient students of all different languages and origins, and we've done hundreds and hundreds of complaint investigations, compliance reviews. This executive order, what's important about this is that it also required the federal government to guarantee meaningful access to LEP customers. And that goes back to the year 2000. But in 2011, the Assistant Attorney General asked us to, each federal agency, to really take a very good look to make sure that each federal agency was looking at the various critical missions, you know, within their federal offices and ensuring that access was available, meaningful access was available to limited English proficient persons. And that's a really big issue for this White House initiative because unlike, let's say, the White House initiative on Hispanic excellence, you are very heterogeneous in terms of the languages, you know, spoken by your constituents. So I've also had the pleasure of briefing a lot of the member agencies that are part of the initiative, the AAPI initiative. So we've worked a lot with them to try and get all federal agencies to address this issue and make their services accessible to LEP persons. And we begin that effort from the perspective, sort of a national perspective, and we know that based on data that we have from the Census Bureau, that there are 6 most prominent languages spoken in the U.S. other than English. And interestingly, 4 out of 6 of those are Asian languages. The most prominent, of course, is Spanish. But other than Spanish, it's Chinese, it's Vietnamese, it's Korean, it's Tagalog. So we really have to be very vigilant on this particular issue. OCR, as you see in some of your notes, has paid particular attention to this issue. We have critical documents, the most critical documents, those documents that explain to customers how they can access our complaint system, how they can communicate with OCR, how they can file a complaint, and what their rights, general rights, civil rights are. And we have translated those critical documents into 20 different languages, and those are actually on our internet website. But in addition to that, we want to make sure that what we're telling districts out there that they need to do, that they need to ensure that LEP students and parents are being taken care of, and that they're effectively communicating with LEP parents about issues affecting their students. We wanted to make sure that we were walking the talk as well. So within OCR, as an example of one office within the department, we ensure that those critical enforcement documents, such as resolution letters and agreements that specifically affect LEP parents, are translated when necessary, and that all communications are facilitated through an interpreter. One of the things we've done within the last couple of years here at ED is that we expanded a over-the-phone interpretation service contract to cover all offices within the Department of Ed. So at any one moment, any office within ED can access an interpreter in over 175 different languages in an average of about 2 minutes. And we're really proud of that accomplishment. We have it funded for the whole department, so there is no excuse for any office within ED not being able to communicate effectively with any constituent. The White House initiative took advantage of this very, very early on. And in fact, I remember just a couple of years ago, one of the first conferences that the AAPI had, the White House initiative had, they made sure that, you know, the contact on the conference registration was available in several of the Asian languages to ensure that parents who wanted to participate could in fact do that. And our Office of Communications really worked hard to make sure that they turn that around very quickly. So it's not just OCR because we do civil rights issues. We want to make that the standard throughout the Department of Ed, whether it's FSA, federal student aid, or even whether it's a question to our Inspector General's office if parents are out there seeing fraud, waste, and abuse. So that's a really significant issue. I'm going to stop there. I think I've covered most everything that's necessary, so that in case there are any questions, we leave plenty of time.
Yes, so it's almost 5 o'clock, but we have extended the call for 15 minutes, so I hope that everybody will be able to stay with us for an additional 15 minutes. Ken is going to talk briefly about how WIAPI and OCR can further help the AAPI community, and then we want to hear from everybody in the audience. So go ahead, Ken.
Great, thank you, Alice. I'll be super quick because I want to make sure we have time for question and answer. I just want to emphasize that in part because of these issues that we've talked about today, because such a large segment of our community is immigrant or limited English proficient, and because there isn't as much community education in terms of legal rights, it's really, really important for WIAPI and OCR and federal government in general to reach out to local community groups, in addition to the national groups like ALDF Coalition, who are can be the intermediaries to some extent to our contacts in local communities. It's really, really crucial to reach out to local community groups, which can be the kind of bridge with the community, both in terms of telling you what issues they're seeing and, quite importantly, encouraging folks whose rights have been violated to file complaints, as well as acting as a bridge in terms of any kind of affirmative outreach and prevention efforts you want to undertake. In the South Philly case that we mentioned, even for ALDF, being based out of New York, which is only a couple hours away from Philly, we would have never, ever gotten day of information about the attacks on December 3rd, 2009, had it not been for our contacts with the local community groups. And that really helped us document what happened and expose a lot of the problems that happened that day, which formed the basis of our complaint and ultimately the settlement and consent decree. So with that, I will turn it back to you guys to wrap up and get some questions from the audience.
So Jenny, if we could open the lines and unmute the audience lines. I think you said that they have to press *1 to ask a question, so I hope that the questions will start rolling in.
Yes, thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, please press *1. You'll be prompted to record your name. To withdraw your request, please press *2. One moment, please, while we wait for questions to queue.
And of course, you can feel free to write your questions in the chat box as well, and we will monitor that.
Hi all, this is Phil. I think I might start off here real quick. Question we get a lot from the communities we work with, and that has to do with solutions to this underreporting problem. So maybe Bob, Ken, and Umar, if you can weigh in. A lot of what we hear when we go to these community engagement events is, what are sort of some best practices or solutions to help make sure parents, many of whom might be LEP or who don't know necessarily how to assert their rights or, the rights of their children, how do we make them aware of those rights and to make sure they have access to be able to report any incidents to the proper authority, whether it's local, at the school itself, or, federal resources?
This is Alice. I think that Lily's presentation about the LEP initiative goes a long way in terms of addressing the concerns of limited English proficient students and parents. And once we are able to revamp the OCR website and make it more accessible for people for whom English is not their first language to access the pre-complaint form and the complaint form. And already many of our guidance documents are on the website in a variety of languages, but it's a little bit harder to find. And so in the coming months, the OCR website will be revamped, so it's much easier for those people to access the content in the language that they're most comfortable with. To follow up on your point, Bill, we have some statistics about how few complaints we get from the AAPI community. So, for example, in fiscal year 2010, OCR received a total of 365 complaints of alleged harassment based on race or national origin, and only 17 of those involved AAPI students. In 2011, the total number was 477, and only 16 of those involved AAPIs. In 2012, it was a total of 520, and the number involving AAPIs was only 31. And the data for fiscal year 2013, as of yesterday, we have received 516 complaints of harassment, but only 12 of those have come from the AAPI community. And so I'll turn it over to Bob and Kin and Amar to talk a little bit more about the possible solutions for getting the word out.
No, I think we want to turn it back over to you guys, but it's just really, I think, helping us get the word out, having your community contacts so that we can reach out to them as a matter of course when we do our communications, our press releases and things like that. I think we would love to have a more robust list of contacts, whether press or organizations, so that those groups get used to seeing our information and our contact information and can stay in touch with us. So that alone, I think, would be really helpful. Mm-hmm. And then other suggestions that you have for outreach for us, forums, conferences, community meetings, suggestions that we could do, that our regional offices might want to partake in. I mean, truth be told, we can't do tons of outreach and travel in these sequestered times, but if there's community groups and organizations near our offices, I think that we would be happy to forward that information to some of the folks on the call and some of the other regional office staff. Anything else anyone wants to add, or any of our other people on the phone?
This is Amar from the White House Initiative and the SICK Coalition. Let me just say on the grassroots, the challenge with reporting is that parents don't even know that bullying is happening. They're in denial. So I'll just say really quickly that for the bullying prevention conference we had in New York in October 2012, I had a conversation with a SICK community leader, and I invited him to the conference, and he had sort of basically said to me, "Sure, we'll come to the conference and we'll bring a busload of parents and kids, but bullying's not really an issue in our I haven't heard anything about bullying, but we're interested and we'll come." And after the conference, he says to me, "I had no idea it was so bad with the kids in our community." And I still remember a parent coming to me and saying, "My kid never talked to me about this until this conference." The issue of being bullied in school. And so in terms of best practices reaching out to parents, obviously there are a few things that are a bit more cost efficient but high ROI in terms of outreach. Our federal government needs to come up with its top 5 languages of AAPI students that are bullied, advertise in ethnic media. That these agencies exist, that school bullying happens, that is prohibited, and this is who you contact if it happens. Similarly, appearing on the ethnic TV channels, and most of them will allow you to come on for free if you're going to talk about something that could help the community, would likely be very welcome and very effective in terms of getting the word out. And then, of course, literature that's in language, English and the relevant language, that can be distributed by our community organizations, on the issue is another tried and true means of reaching out effectively.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, we have a number of publications available in 20 different languages, and we would be happy to get that to you. We just made the same offer to the White House Hispanic Initiative. We just met with them, and they expressed the same concern. What can we have that we can distribute out there when we go out to the community? And we'd be more than happy to make that available. One other thing that I wanted to mention that maybe the AAPI initiative can help us with, when we do our external rollout of this notion, our department plan, basically that we're open for business in any language and that any parent can come to the Department of Ed no matter what language they speak, we are trying to establish a significant contact that we've developed with through the White House Hispanic Initiative, person who sits on their board who is on Univision, and maybe explore the possibility of a PSA announcement that the Secretary could participate in. If the AAPI has those same contacts, we would love to do the thing and have Arnie out there basically, through an interpreter in 2 or 3 or 4 different Asian languages saying, hey, we're open for parents, come to us, we can help you in any language.
And I have something to add to that as well. Kim, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. So I agree with everything that's been said so far, particularly with regard to outreach and while we too have experienced the problem of underreporting. I mean, I don't know how many times I've gone to places like South Philly or Lafayette, and the first thing I ask students who've been harassed is, did you report it? And they say, no, the school isn't going to do anything. And, while that actually may be true in that individual instance, right, in terms of the school's follow-up, I think that we can do a lot to let the people in the community and the victims know that that's not legal for the school to not do that. There will be support from higher up, from OCR and the Department of Justice and the federal government if schools fall short in that way. And I think the other thing that can be done in addition to outreach to support these rights is just general improvement in language access and general enforcement of language rights. So there's actually fairly strong laws, as you know, under Title VI in terms of interpretation and translation for English language learners and their parents, particularly for important documents and communications, and particularly for those ethnic groups that are well represented in a school district. But as you may also know, the actual enforcement has been pretty lax, not due to any fault of OCRs, but simply because there's a lot of school districts out there that have become a lot more diverse in recent years than they have been, and they haven't been able to keep up. And I think OCR really relies on complaints from the community to follow up. But I think that the recent emphasis on vigorously prosecuting those claims by OCR, I think is a big help, and it's something that I hope that you'll also keep up.
Thank you. It'd be good to hear from other folks on the that are on the call.
There are no questions on the line at this time.
And I just wanted to add, just to follow up on what is it, Kim?
Kim, yeah.
Kim just said, I think it's rare that we have either complaint or compliance review that focuses on the issue of services to ELL students or LEP parents where we don't find a problem. It's actually very rare the occasion where we don't find a problem. So we have, hundreds of these agreements out there, and it's great, to get help from community organizations and advocacy groups in terms of organizing parents to file those, because unfortunately those are predominantly the parents who don't file these complaints. They feel disempowered and disenfranchised. They don't speak the language. Sometimes they're hesitant to come forward. So it's through the efforts of many of the advocacy groups that we have received a lot of the complaints and information to base our compliance reviews on about necessary services to parents, limited English proficient parents who are not receiving them. And we do have I remember just recently we translated on 2 different occasions 20-page letter and compliance agreement for the Seattle office, one in Mandarin and one in Vietnamese. So we do make efforts to ensure that parents can feel empowered so that they can go back to their school district and say, hey, you know, this OCR plan says, you know, you owe us X, Y, Z. We haven't seen these discipline procedures in our language. You know, how can we be more involved? So we're hoping those efforts will really will help bring this to the communities.
All right. Well, this is Phil. I want to take this opportunity to again thank our panelists. Thank you, Bob, Lillian, and Alice. Thanks as well to Amr and Kin for taking time out of their busy schedules and help with this educational effort. If you have any questions, please be sure to follow up with us. We will have the slide deck available with the accompanying audio recording later this week, and we can send that out to you when we have that put together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
That concludes today's conference call. Thank you for participating. You may